Professor Jason Furman var ordförande för det mäktiga Council of Economic Advisors under Barack Obama. Hur ser han på den amerikanska ekonomin framöver? Professor Jason Furman, welcome to Sweden. Sorry about the weather.
I didn't come here for the weather.
You did not come here for the weather. So you've worked in both the Clinton White House and the Obama White House. How do President Clinton and President Obama differ in their approach to economic advisors?
Both of them were real policy wonks. Both of them love talking about public policy.
Why am I not surprised?
But with President Clinton, he, got a little bit more into the details. Like, is it going to be a 30% matching grant or a 20% matching grant? Is it going to be a competitive formula or some other formula? He would find that type of thing really interesting. President Obama liked to step back and look at some of the deeper underlying questions. And President Clinton liked to talk about the economics and politics together. And President Obama liked to have an economic discussion first, and once we had covered the economics, bring the political advisors into it to ask, how can we get this done?
What's the difference between Trumponomics and Reaganomics?
Trumponomics is a little bit hard to understand exactly what it is right now, because there's a lot of different proposals that have been made and contradicted and gone in other directions. But on the budget side, Trumponomics is much more extreme than Reaganomics. And Reagan had a lot of cooperation from Democrats for a lot of the things he did. His major tax reform was passed with a lot of Democratic votes. President Trump's agenda, though, is much more of a partisan, party line, Republican-only agenda. So it has larger tax cuts, it has larger cuts to low-income programs. Like President Reagan, President Reagan had a lot of restraints on trade, and President Trump's top trade negotiator worked in the Reagan administration. I think is going to bring some of those Reagan-era restrictions on trade back into use.
So is it unfair to compare the two?
I mean, the economic circumstances are very different. When President Reagan came into office, we had a 10% unemployment rate. When President Trump did, we had an unemployment rate less than 5%. So our economic challenges now are much more about how to foster long-term growth and to do that in a way that's shared by people, as opposed to then when it was getting out of a recession. So no, I don't think I wouldn't compare them.
So speaking about growth, President Trump's budget obviously rests on the assumption that the US will see 3% growth rate. You don't think that is very likely to happen?
Yeah, I think that's a ludicrous economic forecast.
Ludicrous.
And if you look, that forecast is 1 percentage point above what the private sector is forecasting. There was no budget under President Clinton, President Bush, or President Obama that ever assumed growth more than 1/10 of a percentage point higher than what the private sector was forecasting. So it's really out of step with what professionals think. And the reason that professionals are less optimistic about growth is that America, like Sweden and like most advanced economies, has a big demographic challenge. We have an aging population, more people are retiring, less new workers are coming into the workforce, and because of that, you would need really phenomenal levels of productivity growth to hit the 3% growth target. I think a number more like 1.8% would be reasonable.
So it sounds a bit like maybe in the current situation there's not that much a politician can do to increase growth rates?
I think there's some things that could add a couple tenths if you did the right things, and if you did the wrong things you could subtract a couple tenths. So if we reformed our business tax system to lower the tax rate, expanded international trade, increased investment in infrastructure, and cut the deficit, we might be able to raise the growth rate from 1.8 to 2.3. And conversely, if we cut public investment and reduce trade and reduce immigration, that would reduce our growth rate.
Which is what President Trump is proposing.
I'm worried that President Trump has some things that might help growth, like some of his regulatory reforms, but that a lot of things like restrictions on immigration, restrictions on trade, increases in the budget deficit will subtract from our growth over the medium and long run and leave us poorer as a result.
So you worked for President Obama. In retrospect, which economic problems in the US economy do you think contributed to the rise of Donald Trump?
Well, we did a very good job on the cyclical side. Came in with a huge recession, helped get the United States out of that recession. But a lot of the underlying structural problems, the trend towards slower productivity growth, the trend towards rising inequality, the trend towards a larger fraction of the population not working, had been going on before Obama was president and continued during his presidency. We made some progress on some of those issues and would have made a lot more if Congress had passed our entire agenda, but did not sufficiently address those. And so I think income today is basically about where it was for the typical family prior to the recession. So you've had a decade where you've repaired the damage but haven't made sustained gains, and I think that's taken a toll on our politics.
Because you've written about the declining male labor market participation rate, and with President Trump, people talk about that it's the angry white unemployed men. Do you see any connection there?
I think I've never made a systematic study of politics and of political science, so I'm just casually speculating. But
you did work in the White House for 11 years. So
but when you look at nearly 20% of men with a high school degree or less aren't in the workforce at all anymore, and you see that group, high school or less, voting in disproportionately large numbers for President Trump, I think there is a link between some of our underlying structural economic dysfunctions and some of the rise of populism that we've seen. And the unfortunate thing about that, though, is that the reaction people have had to these changes in economic circumstances is not going to bring about policies that will make them better. In fact, could bring about policies that will make things worse.
So what could help with this, with the decreased labor market participation of men?
Well, one thing is the United States just invests much less than other countries in training and helping people find jobs. We invest 0.2% of our GDP. Sweden, I think, is about 5 times as much of that relative to its economy. So one thing is we just need to try harder. We need to do more, invest more in community colleges, invest more in apprenticeships, invest more in training. I think a stronger economy would help, so continuing to bring the unemployment rate down and some more cyclical strengthening of the economy would be welcome as well.
So how was it working in the White House during the Great Recession?
You know, it was a terrible thing for the country, but it was an interesting thing to be an economic policymaker at that time. And our chief of staff at the time, a guy named Rahm Emanuel, had a famous phrase, which was, never let a good crisis go to waste. So when we were doing our big fiscal stimulus, the Recovery Act in 2009, we didn't just include temporary measures to help the economy right away. We included more investments in science, more investments in infrastructure, changes to our unemployment insurance system, changes to the tax system for low-income Americans, and many of those changes have lasted. So we really did try to use it as an opportunity to ask, while we're doing everything we can to fight the financial crisis, how can we increase growth and make the economy safer going forward?
Why does the Fed need a new 4% inflation target? I know you signed a letter arguing for this.
I think we need a higher target. I'm not sure what the number is. I am petrified that the next time we go into a recession, the Fed won't have the tools it needs to. In the global financial crisis, the Fed cut rates by 500 basis points to deal with it. That's about the average interest rate cut that we've seen for recessions in the past. Going forward, the equilibrium interest rate is probably going to be closer to something like 4, maybe even below that. And so we're going to have much less scope for conventional monetary policy to cut interest rates in the future than it had in the past. What really matters to the economy is the real interest rate. That's the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. So if we can't cut the nominal interest rate as much, we could help the economy by having a higher inflation rate. And with a higher inflation rate, that means people would want to spend more now, they'd want to invest more now before the purchasing power of their money disappeared. So I think running a higher inflation target now in a world of low interest rates would help give this Fed more space to deal with a future recession.
Why a higher target and not sort of a different target, like a nominal growth domestic product target or something different?
Look, I think we should be having a wide range of discussion. And we've had a monetary rule that has worked pretty well for a long time. The fact that we've been below our inflation target for the last 9 years, and it took a while to recover, means it didn't work perfectly in this recession, and I think it might work even less well in the next one. So we need to be having a conversation now about nominal GDP targeting, higher inflation targeting, unconventional monetary policy, and maybe moving towards phasing out cash so that we could have negative interest rates on a sustained basis. I think all of those should be under discussion. Of that list, changing the inflation target, I think in some ways is the easiest and less disruptive, and so I would put it towards the top of the list, but I'm all for discussing everything. Have
you tried any of these ideas in Sweden? Because in Sweden there's a very sort of strong inheritance from sort of trade union economists like Gösta Rehn and Rudolf Meiner about that inflation is terrible because it hurts the poor.
In the United States there is most on the progressive side tend to be fine with higher inflation, and they think the issue though isn't what's the direct effect of inflation on the poor. The issue is in a monetary system with a 3 or a 4% inflation target, I think we would have less frequent recessions and less severe recessions, and that has, I think, a much bigger impact on the poor than inflation does.
So what would be your sort of top recommendations for increasing productivity in the American economy?
I would expand international trade. I would have more talented people, including any talented people from Sweden that want to move to the United States. We're still a very welcoming country. We'd love to have you contributing to our innovation. And I do think our business tax system is ridiculously outmoded. All the other countries in the world have cut their corporate rates. Ours is the highest of any of the major economies in the world. It's increasingly dysfunctional. It's increasingly driving our companies overseas. So I think that fixing that's a really top priority. Should be a really top priority.
So what about the robots? Will they increase productivity and take all our jobs?
I would love to see more robots. I think the problem we've had in our economy is not too many robots, but too few. If you look at the last 8 years, we've had very strong job growth, but weak GDP growth. And that's the opposite of what life would be like if we had a lot of robots doing the work that humans had. Now, if we get all of these robots, I think we'll have a high order problem that I'd love to have of the impacts and the disruption it would cause on labor markets. I think more of what we were talking about earlier in terms of training, education will be important so that we can maintain a high employment level in the face of all those robots. But I think if we do the right thing, they'd almost entirely be a plus for our economy.
You don't mention universal basic income, which many people, for example, Mark Zuckerberg has brought up as a sort of a solution to the robots taking all our jobs. You don't believe in it?
I don't. First of all, the numbers don't add up. If we tried to do a universal basic income, it would massively bust the budget, and the United States wouldn't be willing to raise taxes enough to pay for it. But more of the problem, I think, is that it's an abdication of what we should be doing. What we should be trying to do is figuring out how people can get jobs, how they can get training for jobs. I think that's important, not just for our overall economic performance, but just for the basic human dignity that people have participating in our society by participating in our economy. And a universal basic income says, when it comes to jobs, never mind. We're not going to worry about that. We'll just cut a check for you. I think that's the wrong attitude.
Some people say it would increase risk-taking, innovation.
I think there's relatively little evidence for that. I think we should have a good safety net. You shouldn't lose your health insurance just because you lose your job, and we've made improvements in that dimension. But I think we should have, I'd be much more sympathetic to, for example, wage subsidies, that if you have a job, we'll subsidize you and pay you extra for doing that job. That type of thing, I think it would be a pro-work direction to move.
Thank you very much, Jason Furman.
Great talking.
Thank you.